Good afternoon. All right, hi guys. All right, so let me get your names down, and we're going to go over. Hopefully, you're doing okay on your test. You have two chances at it, and you have until tonight at midnight. And then now we're going into the following subject is a comparison of the wars for independence from their European colonial powers. All right, and so I also was finally able to correct a couple of your uh, assignments, and you guys did very well. You guys absolutely grasped what I was asking of you, and I appreciate that. And so just please keep the same kind of format that most of you guys are using, the same approach to it. You're doing very well. Okay. Before I get into this topic, are there any questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself. All right. So what we'll go ahead and do is we'll share the screen and we'll jump right into it. All right. So with this, right, you have a certain interpretations to the wars for independence, especially the U.S. The U.S. There's more variety in the historiography or the art and science of history writing. There's more variety in interpreting the American War for Independence than there is of those in Spain or in Spanish America. And I think some of that is because in Spanish America you have contentions that several people tried some truly revolutionary changes, and they didn't quite stick. Okay, we'll get into that. With the Americans, right? You have more conservative interpretations than that. Just kind of a good old boy club, privileged demographic, ran the show from the beginning, had self-interest in mind all along. And then that goes to the other extreme of American exceptionalism, contending that that they truly had a revolution here. And remember, for something to be considered a revolution, it ought to entail an 180-degree turn politically with government, economically with the allocation of resources or the type of economic system that you have, etc., and also socially with your values. So that's tough to hit, right? That's why oftentimes people are pretty stingy with that word revolution. They usually use it with the French Revolution and the Russian Bolshevik Revolution because it is quite easy to find quite a 180-degree turn in all three categories in those instances. So anyway, no matter what your interpretation is going to dictate the kind of facts that you look for, right? And the kind of facts that you're going to conveniently omit. Nevertheless, I felt like these topics here, especially with the American War for Independence, are almost universally considered, no matter what your interpretation is, they're almost universally considered relevant, that you ought to consider them when you're looking at the American War for Independence. All right. So one thing, right, is ambiguity when it comes to the Americans, the Norte Americanos, as the Latinos would call us, the North Americans. English common law is organic. It's not written on a single constitution. It organically grows like a living organism from laws passed by Parliament, executive decrees by the King and Queen, judicial decisions made by their courts, etc., and just flat out traditions. So at any rate, it's going to be difficult for the colonists to peg where exactly they stood, what exact rights they were entitled to as English subjects, because there's not a definitive document that they could just look to, just one single document. All right. Also, to complicate it, is there were at least two or three, but not many more, colonial charters, right? Remember, the colonial charters, many of them were granted by a completely separate king and administration from one another. So James the First, right, was when gave the Virginia Company. And then you have James II give Pennsylvania. You have Charles give the Carolinas, etc. Anyway, some of those documents contended quite specifically that the people in this given colony, under this given specific charter, are entitled to all the rights of English subjects. Okay, so there were a few that said that, but not all of them. Right? So what are they just going to recognize because, in a very legal interpretation, are they just going to recognize the rights of Englishmen, people in Maryland and Massachusetts, etc.? No, that would be too messy. So another reason why, there was ambiguity as far as what our rights were. All right. Then in addition to that, you had the French and Indian War. And with the French and Indian War, it's pretty universally conveyed that the British felt we did not pull our weight in that war. If you've read like Last of the Mohicans, etc., that's the war, right? From 1756 to 1763. 1754, 2 years sooner, they were already fighting in Europe, England and France, or elsewhere. And then it caught on in North America in 56. The English began requisitioning, asking the colonial assemblies, which were the elected reps of the colonists, for a certain amount of taxes, revenue, and for a certain number of troops as militiamen to fight with the British regulars against their French enemies. Now, of course, what King George III would say is that the American colonists were the freest colonists in the world to get to live under England, under Great Britain, as opposed to France, Spain, etc. And so hence it was in their best interest to make sure that the British won this war and they could secure the frontier away from France and have it available for the colonists in future generations. So the British said it was in our best interest to fight with them, that they were at least partially fighting for us. And from the primary sources, there were contentions that we didn't buy that. Okay, so this starts the friction. Is the British felt, and matter of fact, a case in point was William Pitt. William Pitt came here and began forcefully drafting the young American boys, and on kind of a program back in England where he said the Americans are going to finally pull their weight. So there was resentment, especially amongst the conservative Tories back in England. Then to make it worse, they had news in the newspapers that we were smuggling with the French enemy down in Louisiana and in the Caribbean. So here they were supposedly partially fighting for us, and we're trading with the enemy at that time. So there was definitely a sense of like, amongst the Tories especially, that at the end of the French and Indian War, when the British are going to defeat the French, that their American colonists need to be put in their place. They need to learn who they are, where they are in the food chain, and they need to learn that they have to carry their weight in the future. Then in addition to that, gaining all that land, because it began, right, because the French went down and established modern day Pittsburgh and in western Pennsylvania, and we're around the Great Lakes and up along the Mississippi River. So now that land is open up to us under Britain, because Britain took it from France. Britain took Canada from France. And so with that, right, the British feel like they need to organize this new territory that has been greatly augmented or increased by their victory. So they want to kind of reshuffle and reallocate soldiers and British officials and tax collectors and so forth much more effectively and thoroughly throughout the American colonies at the end of this war. And I think anybody would consider that relevant context as well. Then, of course, people greatly vary as to the significance of this next part, and that is the Enlightenment. Okay, so you had the French and Scottish Enlightenments, and they kind of took fire, right, in Europe. And so you have people, right, and especially give credit where credit's due, especially in Latin America, Miguel Hidalgo, the guy who gave the Grito de Dolores, the shout of Dolores. He had salons, SALONS, and they were like intellectual meetings where they would read these banned Enlightenment books and talk about them and discuss government, etc. And yes, sometimes, right, as they began to question everything, some of their arguments and discussions could be deemed by conservatives to be semi treasonous and defiant, all right, at these salons. Well, what were some of the main beliefs? As remember with the French Enlightenment, most of them with their ideology or their worldview, a lot of them were deists, Deists. They believed that there was a great kind of watchmaker, like clockmaker, right? A god who created the universe, and excuse me, and he created it in such a way that it was meant to run itself by natural laws. So the Enlightenment was big on science, empirical science, etc. Okay, but these natural laws, right? They go very, very far beyond what we would consider the hard sciences today: biology, chemistry, astronomy, physics, etc. Right? They also believe that there were natural laws that governed human beings. They believe that man was somewhat knowable, predictable, as far as what makes him tick, what he desires, what he fears, what he can tolerate and what he won't tolerate, etc. Right? And to them, right, quite simply, if we would just adhere to the Creator's natural laws in all realms, society would be at its healthiest. Okay. And of course, you had Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he writes at the very beginning of his social contract book, right? Man was born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. Okay. And so to them, they believed the natural state of man was freedom, was autonomy to decide his own destiny, etc. And that tyranny, despotism, was that which was unnatural and a break in natural law. All right. So they believed in natural rights. And so, for instance, right, government to them was a necessary evil that was meant to protect our natural rights. You probably have heard of the social contract. And the idea was, right, by Rousseau and by John Locke, that at one time man was enviably in a state of nature, like anarchy, no government at all, no institutions, each man for himself, hunter-gatherers, etc. And of course, man was completely autonomous, as nature intended it. However, sometimes people, they violate that freedom and they step upon the freedoms of other people, that you're inevitably going to run into bullies. Okay. And because of those bullies, there was an acquiescence, right? Like they grudgingly gave in, these first people, supposedly, to allow a government to exist. But here's it, right? Is they said, okay, government, you're allowed to exist, but you are our servant and not our master. You are here to protect our natural rights, what we're entitled to, when someone else tries to infringe upon those liberties. Okay, the social contract. And the three natural rights that Locke and Rousseau mentioned were the right to life. No one should have the right to take your life and to physically harm you. The right to liberty, right? To do what you want to do economically, do what you want to do with your ideology, as far as what you believe in, etc. And then thirdly, your property. And property, of course, did not just mean property in the modern sense of owning a piece of land or a business. Property also entailed, more generically, the fruits of your labor. If you work hard and you are entitled to be remunerated, to be rewarded or paid in one way or another, and benefit from your own hard work. So needless to say, the Enlightenment was against slavery, right? Because that's unremunerated labor that they're getting nothing in return for. Then you had other people jump up with ideas of natural rights. Couple of them that I think, and I can't prove it, but I think Thomas Jefferson was thinking of when he said the pursuit of happiness, are a guy named Diderot, spelled like Diderot, and Condorcet, Condorcet. Diderot and Condorcet wrote some of the earliest encyclopedias because they wanted the masses to become literate through an education system and to be able to learn, freely learn, right, as much as they could with no hindrances regarding their socioeconomic background, nationality, etc., right? But in addition to learning, right, the idea was to cultivate yourself, right? To become a more complete, for lack of a better adjective, more of a complete human being. Okay, become well-rounded like a Renaissance man, become successful. And once again, just learn everything that you can. I personally think of them when I think of Jefferson saying the pursuit of happiness. So at any rate, you also had a guy named Beccaria, Beccaria, and Beccaria was on the rights of suspects. If you are suspected of having committed a crime, no cruel and unusual punishment, no torture to elicit a confession, a speedy trial, a trial by your fellow peers of your same area of inhabitation, and also the same socioeconomic status as you. Right? Voltaire, Voltaire. Voltaire was an iconoclast. He smashed everything sacred. He made fun of the Catholic Church. He made fun of Christ and Christianity. And he had a follower say, supposedly one time, I disagree with what you're saying, but I defend to the death your right to say it. So Voltaire is kind of our First Amendment guy. Freedom of expression, freedom of independent thinking, freedom of protest, etc. And Voltaire had to flee France. They wanted his hide. So he was constantly on the move for things that he was writing, just tearing in to different leaders and institutions. Right. Then the Scottish Enlightenment, basically in a nutshell to me, was libertarianism, right? Government don't tread on me, fearful of big government, distrustful of big government, want to keep government as small, decentralized, and localized as possible to be able to better hold it accountable. The idea of a government having an armed force that if it wanted to could turn on its own people and overpower them was frightening to the Scottish liberals. And so they were real big on the, later Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And of course, they initially meant, if need be, bearing arms against their own nation's military. Right. And then also, by the way, there were two guys named Trenchard, Trenchard, and Gordon. I don't recall their first names, but at any rate, they had a newspaper called Cato's Letters. And what they did is they synthesized ideas of the French Enlightenment, ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, with what was going on in their day in Mother England. And if they saw any violations of those rights that they were beginning to feel entitled to, according to these enlightenments, they wanted the world to know, and they would print it. So they became kind of enemies number one to King George III. And they actually met with Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin printed their Cato Letters articles here in the States. All right. Then moving on to the Latin Americans, the main two things that they usually point to, right? Well, actually, I take that back. There are like three, at least three. All right. One were called the Bourbon Reforms. Okay. And with the Bourbon Reforms, they allowed greater economic activity amongst the Latin Americans. They relaxed on their mercantilist, monopoly-based system, and they allowed more opportunities for more people. So a group of people that were able to take advantage of that because they had access to credit and now no longer needed the proper paperwork were the well-to-do mestizo and criollo men who had a Spanish dad who had some money. Okay. So on the one hand, they're getting a taste of a better life. And the idea is that it's enhancing their sense of expectation, their sense of entitlement, their collective confidence, etc. But at the very same time of granting them more economic opportunities, the Bourbon Reforms stripped them of political power. It was quite an odd combination. It was called the intendant system, and they put Spanish intendants at virtually every level of government. And these dudes were Spaniards who were handpicked. And so they took away a lot from local autonomy. They took away a lot from representative democratic government. And it was very, very popularly opposed, this intendant system in the Bourbon Reforms. All right. Then another thing, as I mentioned, are the salons. You had a very educated, very progressive group of Catholic clergymen, and which is all the more impressive, right? Because you're only dealing 100 years after the Spanish Inquisition was really, rearing its ugly head in multiple countries. So going back to Miguel Hidalgo, right? He had Voltaire, who bashed the church and Christ in his library, read him, spoke about him at his salons. Okay. There was a guy named Mirandola, and Mirandola had direct ties to revolutionary France, because as you may know, the Latin American Wars for Independence were between 1810 and the mid 1820s, and the French Revolution was in 1789 to 1794. And so, and an American War for Independence or Revolution was 1775 to 1783. So the Americans had already broken free and become a country. And the Latin American priests and friars like to talk about that. The French had already had their radical phase of the Jacobins taking control of the French Revolution. So they had a lot to talk about, a lot to compare and contrast, etc. And Miguel Hidalgo got in trouble with his own Catholic hierarchy for having these salons and for the controversial things that they read and discussed. And again, Francisco de Miranda, he was getting direct French propaganda and trying to spread it in South America. All right. So that was another thing that got the ball rolling. And as you probably know, the Mexican people celebrate September 16th, just yesterday, with Father Miguel Hidalgo's Cry of Dolores, his grito or shout of Dolores. And he tried to get mainly an army of very poor farming, peasant, and mining indigenous people that attended his church to rise up in arms against the Spaniards. They called them Gachupines. So at any rate, they chased the Spaniards to a granary. Okay, it was called the Alhóndiga. And when they were inside the Alhóndiga, this rebel army, a lot of them just had pickaxes and no guns and machetes. They made it into the Alhóndiga and they butchered the Spanish people. there in Guanajuato. All right. And so the Mexican government, the Spanish government of Mexico, was just aghast. Well, it's going to take some time for them to beat Miguel Hidalgo, but he is defeated. His army just was not well disciplined, and they actually, something happened, a mistake from a wagon, and it started a fire in the middle of the battle and isolated most of his men inside the fire. And the Spaniards took advantage of it, defeated him, took him as prisoner, had him defrocked so he can no longer be considered a priest, and then had him executed. And it didn't take long at all until another priest came in and took his spot. And the same thing. He won a few battles, and he was eventually captured, captured, and executed. All right. So it wasn't the beginning of Mexican independence. It's going to take him a while, but it was the beginning of all the drama unfolding against Spain. And then the dramatic third thing that people will mention as context to the Latin American Wars for Independence was Napoleon's takeover of Spain. Mother Spain is their colonizer, right? And now Mother Spain has been taken over. There was a king, and there was a lot of, kind of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette type stuff. I'm trying to think of the king's name. I have it down here. But at any rate, he let his woman sleep around on him, and with especially one of the dukes or counts who they saw as like that crazy guy in Russia that had a spell over the Tsar Nicholas II's family, Rasputin. This guy is going to get torn to pieces by a mob, by the way. They were very neglectful of bread riots and other economic maladies that Spain was facing, and they didn't do much to help the people. So he was a very unpopular king, and they hated his queen. So at any rate, he goes in hiding, and Napoleon tricks him. He says, "Here, come meet me at this chateau, and we'll consider the next act." And so he not only comes, but he brings his heir, a young boy named Ferdinand VII, who would be Ferdinand VII. And Napoleon just captures them and takes them as his hostages. He puts his brother, Joseph, on the throne in Spain. So then the Spanish, from their city councils, from their regional governors, they started making emergency juntas, Junta, like committees, right? And these juntas declared they did not recognize Joseph Bonaparte as their leader. They were waiting on Ferdinand VII to take the throne, because again, they hated his mom and dad. So they were waiting on this kid to take the throne. And they said, this is what's interesting, is they said, in the meantime, we are sovereign. And some of them even went, because the Enlightenment was big in Spain, in some areas too. Some of them even went so far and declared popular sovereignty, saying by order of the vote of the people in Castile, we all give our permission to this junta in the meantime to rule over us. All right. And so the authorities in Spain find themselves in a quite a bifurcation, like everyone split in two, right? So if you're a Spanish viceroy, if you're a corregidor, right, you do not want to break free from Spain, because life is great under Spain. You're powerful, you're wealthy, you have all these privileges, right? So you understand that you don't want to bear allegiance to Napoleon's brother either, but you definitely don't like the idea of popular sovereignty, right? That we, the people of Mexico, are going to elect our own leader, and at least until Fernando VII takes the throne back. And then, of course, a lot of the well-to-do criollos who had Spanish parents but were born here in the Americas and were very ambitious. A lot of criollos took that rebellious stand, said that we don't recognize the current Spanish government under France, and we declare popular sovereignty, and we are our own bosses until Fernando or Ferdinand VII comes back. Well, there's a book I read, and he called it The Mask of Fernando, The Mask of Ferdinand. He thinks that it was not genuine on behalf of a lot of these revolutionaries here in Latin America, that they were never going to, they weren't going to go backwards, right? They had taken a huge leap forward. Spain was no more, basically. It was under France. So their colonizer right now is no more. This huge step forward is they are their own bosses. They get to elect their own leaders, have their own sovereignty. They weren't about to go backwards and then say, okay, we'll go back to the old school way, and we all declare our allegiance to Fernando VII. So he called it the Mask of Ferdinand, that they didn't have the guts to admit that yet, but they were wearing that mask. And what helps them take that mask off is finally Napoleon has a reversal of fortune, and he evacuates Spain because he's got bigger fish to fry. And he, what was I going to say? He's got bigger things to worry about. And so, so Ferdinand VII takes the throne. So now he's back, supposedly what everybody wanted, right? But I kid you not, he comes back and he declares divine right to rule. He takes them way backwards. Because you got to remember, by the early 1800s, most countries had already made their monarchs swear to rule jointly with their parliament, with their elected parliament, and to abide by the rule of law. So this is a major step backward by Ferdinand. And even though there were a lot of protests in Spain, they weren't going to, try to topple the government and have a completely new government or anything like that. They just kind of took it in the chin, but not here in Latin America. In Latin America, you had these juntas that were established in Mexico City. The most radical in Mexico was at, I'm going to butcher this name, Querétaro. You had some radical guys at Querétaro who wanted the natural rights of all men, government by consent. The government is our servant, not our master. We will not abide by Ferdinand VII. If we have to declare independence, we will, etc. So at any rate, Ferdinand sends his troops to the Americas, and they're going to have virtually civil wars all throughout Latin America. Right. Then in America, back up to the gringos, it started with those taxes, right? First was the sugar tax. Then you had, of course, tax on lead, on tea, on paint, all kinds of commodities, right? And for the first time, they're not asking the colonial assemblies to give their permission to these taxes. Parliament is just doing it on its own. So Benjamin Franklin travels to Parliament across the Atlantic. And what he does, right, knowing that English history is organic, is he gives instance after instance, and not only English history, but in colonial history, of colonists here and there garnering certain rights. And he says, by virtue of, Maryland, we have trial by jury. By virtue of Massachusetts, we have no taxation without representation, no taxation without elected reps approving it. It just went one right by one right in the exact year where they were established in each colony. And that really was the way to do it under English common law, this organic view of it. But it gets done, right? And the British Tories just very arrogantly tell him, that was great, man. That was great if you lived here. You would have just won your right in your borough, in your English district, to your rights. But you are a colonist, and we can or cannot we could choose to or not to acknowledge your access to English common law because you're mere colonists. And Benjamin Franklin was furious. All right. So they start rebelling against the taxes. They start attacking the customs officials who came to collect the taxes. There was the Gaspé Affair in Rhode Island, and they actually caught the customs officials' boat on fire and caused it to sink. 9 colonies got together with the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress and declared that we have one another's back, and we will not, none of us, agree to collect a tax that has not first been passed by us, the elected assemblymen. So that was pretty big. Then in 1772, a big step was made with the Committees of Correspondence. The Committees of Correspondence, what they did is, just like the name implies, if any rights were taken away from any government in any of the colonies, they would support them, they would give knowledge to all the other colonies, and demand that everybody have a united front. So if one colony is picked on, all of the colonies are going to deal with it in the Committees of Correspondence. Another thing that was big is the British governors began giving ultimatums to their militiamen that they're going to be loyal to Mother England, and that if this resorts in an upheaval, that they're willing to squash it militarily beside Mother England. And a lot of them literally split in half, right? And some said, I will not fight against my fellow colonists, or I do agree with the colonists, etc., right? So many of them left the colonial militias, including Washington, and now they had to meet secretly, informally, right, on their own, and they boasted that they could be ready at a minute's notice to defend their rights, and so hence they called themselves and were called the Minutemen, as opposed to the British militia. All right, I want to go back to this later. Okay. So when the Americans win their independence, right, you still are going to have an upper and a lower legislative branch in each of the states. The governors now are elected. Okay. They issue declarations that are quoting the French Enlightenment. But the guys who were already the well-to-do leaders before the War for Independence, who were the ones looked up to be elected year after year as the assemblymen, you got to remember, they're not the average dudes, these assemblymen. Like, a lot of them went to college, and fewer than 1% of Americans were going to college at this time. So they're kind of the cream of the crop, if you will, these assemblymen, right? Well, this class of Americans are going to be the ones who take control of the War for Independence. And then when they make their own government, they ensure that they get to, that all property ownership stays the same as it was before the revolution. It stays the same after. But they do contend that culturally, we're no longer for a monarch. We are for popular rule. We're more egalitarian, everyone on equal footing, even if it's empty rhetoric and propaganda. And we said goodbye to the mercantilist system, and we opened a free, open capitalist system for all to compete in. So can you kind of see how some people think the American War for Independence was revolutionary and others do not? So real quickly, the salutary neglect thesis is the thesis that is popular in England itself, and that is that they left us alone, and it had a healthy or salutary effect on us. Economically, we defied the mercantilist restrictions and did what we wanted and smuggled economically. And then politically, our assemblies accrued powers that were never intended by Mother England for them to accrue. So then at the end of the French and Indian War, they want to put their foot down, right? And it's like a young man or woman who's now strong, independent, and like 18, 20 years old and says, sorry, Dad, too little, too late. I'm accustomed to doing my own thing. I'm not going to stop now. Okay, so that's known as the salutary neglect thesis, is that we did well economically, we empowered ourselves politically, more than Mother England ever intended, as she kind of ignored us. And then at the end of the French and Indian War, Mother England tried to crack down and go backwards, right, in time and give more restrictions to us. And we said, nope, too little, too late, Dad. We're going to fight to keep a good thing going. So that's number one thesis. Number two is that it really was ideological, right? Is that people were so caught up in the French and Scottish Enlightenments. And not to mention, there was a religious movement too called the Great Awakening. And it was significant, right? And that it told people that if your leaders are not following God, if they're not being righteous, if they're being corrupt and tyrannical, then you have God's blessing to rebel against them. So that was known as the Great Awakening, and that had a psychological effect as well. So at any rate, what happens, right, is you have these writers in France, especially. They're writing in French. Now we have these intellectual bridges or midwives, if you want. And that is like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Dickinson. These guys had the leisure time, they had the education to gain access to these French books, to read them, to imbibe their ideas, and then to put those ideas in a much more simplistic, summarized form for the colonists to understand. Okay? So that these members of the intelligentsia, they became enlightened from what they read, and then they enlightened the commoners in their own more simple form of expression. So hence, right, the most common form of expression was a pamphlet. And pamphlets were usually anything from 8 to 30 pages long. So just short enough that people actually had a chance to read them, had the time to read them. Of course, they were in simple English. So then when people started making their own organizations like the Sons of Liberty, meeting in taverns and other informal areas and forming their Sons of Liberty chapters, they quoted these guys. They quoted Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, Voltaire. Now, they didn't read their books, but they learned the basics of what they stood for from their intellectual leaders, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, etc. So that when all said and done, the average American became, quote, enlightened. And his expectations for what he was entitled to greatly grew. And this is court history, right? Because it implies, right, that while the average country is born on greed, ambition, power struggle, right, that America supposedly was born on these lofty ideas about what man is entitled to and should have. And so somehow that makes us an exceptional country. All right. Then number three is cynical on George Washington. And it just says that it implies that if George Washington would have received what he wanted as an ambitious man under the British, that he may not have rebelled. That he thought first and foremost of himself and his own wealth and his own political advancement. But that wealth and that advancement were stopped, right? There were roadblocks in the way of his ambitions because of British policies. So one is called patronage. And for patronage, you have to have the patronage. You have to have the approval of the right people to get a job, to get a position, including in the military. So other guys that he thought he was a lot more qualified than, right, received the jobs that he wanted because of their connections to the crown. And then with mercantilism, right, he couldn't sell his own farm produce. He had to give it to these merchant middlemen from London who decided where to sell it, for how much to sell it, and then they took a big cut out of it for doing so. And it infuriated him. All right. But as much as he is self-centered and guilty of just absolute selfish ambition, right, in this book, the one tiny redeemable factor is he has some quotes in there whereby he says his problem is not just for himself, but for all Americans, that the British system is unfair and foolish, that the best man should get the job, not the one with patronage, and that the businessman should be able to do his thing without British middlemen doing it for him. All right. Then number 4, this is the most cynical. This says that the poor were fed up with everybody that was rich, not just the British, but the American rich. Remember the class of founding fathers that I mentioned with college education, always the ones elected as the assemblymen, that there was resentment toward them too. Matter of fact, you have letters in this book whereby the commoners are complaining that their elected reps care nothing about them, spend none of their tax revenue to improve anything in their poor sectors. They're only there to enrich themselves, they said. So this rage is going to come out during occasions like the Stamp Act riot in Boston. When the Stamp Act riot occurred, right, the mobs of people began attacking all of the nice ships and homes, all, which included fellow American colonists. John Adams is going to write, Sam Adams, and says, you know, hey, cuz, this is crazy. You're the masses, the mob loves you. Like, tell them not to destroy their fellow American stuff. Tell them that the British are the enemy, not us. So the Howard Zinn, right, the founding fathers shrewdly manipulated the common people by a combination of promising them rewards and threatening punishment. And they kind of, this well-to-do founding father group kind of hijacked the rebellion for themselves and their own benefit, and used and lied to the common people to get them to fight for them. Very cynical thesis. So then lastly, number 5. So what I basically say here, okay, is that Americans, right, when you look at the gap between the left and the right, it was not that far. So for instance, right, on the left, Charles Fourier here, he wants to confiscate property from the rich. He wants to evenly allocate it to everybody and have people cooperatively share the land. sometimes known as Fourier socialism. Okay. You had people in Latin America who wanted to do this. But you look at the liberals amongst Americans, Thomas Jefferson, no way. Patrick Henry, no way. They're not going to give up their huge plantation to give to the poor. They're not going to get rid of anybody's property and hand it over to the poor in some cooperative manner. No way. Okay. Then also far to the left is trusting the government in completely democratic hands. Because you got to recall, right, as people like Aristotle and Plato had written, that given an uneducated, foolish person who lacks self-control, right, so has hence intellectual as well as moral shortcomings, giving him the vote, much less voting him into office, is like putting a 3-year-old behind the wheel of a car. It's absolutely reckless. That those who vote, and especially those who rule and are elected, ought to have virtue and self-control where they put the needs of the community above their own, and ought to have great education and knowing about political science and so forth. But we don't have much of a public school system yet. So this idea of having like genuinely democratic government, our liberals were not for that. Thomas Jefferson pretty much said that, what I just said. Thomas Jefferson said, well, we need to educate the people, then we could trust them, at least with a vote. All right. So, slavery. Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, they did not take a stand against slavery as our leading liberals. They just didn't, for various reasons. So my point being, right, the Americans on the left who wanted reform and liberal changes, right, the Americans on the left were not very far to the left at all. Okay. But the Latinos who were on the left were. So anyway, let me go back up here. Miranda experienced the rare privilege of joining both the American and French revolutions in his travels, and he returned to his native land with pamphlets of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, one of modern history's most radical documents emanating from the French Revolution. And Francisco Miranda was for it. Look at here when they met at the Congress of Chilpancingo under Father Morelos. Let's see here. Amidst his attempted revolution in 1810, he progressively declared the abolition of slavery and of Native American tribute, political equality of for men of all colors, redistribution of land back to the natives, popular sovereignty, that the authority of government rests on the popular permission of those who elect them into office, and representative democracy. And when they met at Chilpancingo, they made all this clear. Right? And then on America's right, I think of John Adams, right? Well, guess what? John Adams did fear the masses. He did not want too democratic of a government, for sure. But he still wanted a republic. And a republic is a mixed government. You have some offices that are democratically elected. You have some offices that are handpicked. All right. John Adams was an abolitionist against slavery. John Adams was not for the mercantilist monopoly system. He wanted free, open market for everybody to start whatever business they wanted, etc. So my point being, right, the guys on the American right, like John Adams, weren't that far to the right at all. So the left and right were like this. They're all kind of moderate. Because they didn't try anything radical. But in Latin America, they did. Look at this in red. This type of boldness elicited an equal and opposite reaction in Latin figures who stood for the Ancien regime or old order. Constitutional monarchies, an aristocracy, a state-established church, ruled by men of Spanish blood. That's pretty far to the right. And that did exist in Latin America. Agustin de Iturbide in Mexico. So you see what I mean? Is what I'm saying is like no good deed goes unpunished. Is because the Latin Americans wanted to take on a program very genuinely much further to the left than the Americans were willing to try. Land redistribution, land return to the Native Americans, right? Democratic government, the political equality of men of all colors and ethnicities and nationalities, and into slavery, right? Because they tried such genuinely radical left-wing changes, it elicited an equal and opposite reaction from the far right, who still wanted a king, who still wanted monopolies, who still wanted an established church of the state, and so forth. So in Mexico and Latin America, right, that American gulf between left and right was way broader. John Adams said, don't vote for Thomas Jefferson. He is going to implement a French Revolution here in the US. He's going to, as you guys may be familiar with, the Jacobins declared the landowning nobility enemies of the state just for the privileges that they had traditionally held in the land ownership. They had not committed a single crime, but it was considered a crime, the privilege that they had received generation after generation. They had their landed estates, properties confiscated from them. They were put through these kangaroo courts where you knew they were going to be held guilty no matter what. And they were beheaded simply for being rich and well-connected. Okay, when the Jacobins took control of the French Revolution. John Adams acted like that was going to happen here if people voted for Jefferson. And then Jefferson's men, right, said, don't vote for the ultra-right conservative John Adams. He is going to become King John I. He's going to shut down Congress and rule unilaterally as his own crown. Okay. John Adams knew that Thomas Jefferson had no taste whatsoever for land redistribution. Okay, no matter how much he spoke in defense of the poor. Thomas Jefferson knew that John Adams was a proud New Englander who was proud of democratic government in New England, and that he was not going to be a monarch. What it was, right, is just hyperbole. Hyperbole is deliberate, strategic exaggeration just to scare people. Deep down, they knew they weren't that far. That their opponent was not that far to the left or the right. That's why when John Adams won, Thomas Jefferson just sat down and waited 4 more years because he knew the world was not going to end. Nothing too far to the right was going to happen. And when then he ran again and beat John Adams in 1800, John Adams sat down and bid his time, knowing that there was not going to be a French Revolution under Thomas Jefferson. All right. But in Latin America, when someone is that much further than you are to the left, when someone is that much genuinely further than you are to the right, you're more apt to think, right, that it's the end of the world, that it's the ruin of your country. And when you think that, you might be more inclined to rise up in rebellion, to refuse to recognize the results of the election, etc. So the big gulf between left and right in Latin America is going to lead to instability, like coups, right? COUPS, a blow to the state, where you just use violence or the threat of violence to cause the administration to step down. Downright civil wars. And of course, what do the Anglos say, the Norte Americanos? Oh, well, it runs in our English political tradition and in our blood. We're sophisticated. We recognize election results. We wait for the next election. We're not savages, right? We're more civilized. Those Latinos are too passionate. They're too led by their emotions and passions. And hence it's in their blood, that fiery Latino blood, for them to have all these coups and civil wars and this and that. And I'm defending the Latinos here, right? And saying, no, that has nothing to do with their constitution, their temperament. That it is the fact that they genuinely had a huge gulf between leaders on the left and leaders on the right. So that when one side won, it looked to the other side like the country was all but ruined. And hence desperate action had to be made. Does that make sense? All right, so that's it, you guys. So this is your assignment. I want you to read through the introduction. I want you to read through the first 4 sections, unless you took good notes, and then just do number 5. Where I'm sticking up for the Latinos and saying at least they tried genuinely radical changes, even though they suffered for it. Making sure I have all your names. All right, I believe I do. All right, you guys have a good week, okay? Good luck with this. If you don't have any questions, that's all I have for today. Thank you, and you'll get your extra credit. Thank you, Xavier. Appreciate that.